Okay, so let's get started. Um, First of all, so you probably all know that the midterm is scheduled in week 8, and therefore, as I promised, just as we did last semester, I would distribute mock exam questions 2 weeks before the midterm. So next week, you get the mock exam questions, and well, the rule is identical, right? So there'll be 4 questions in the mock exam, and then 2 out of the 4 will be chosen to be included in the actual exam, and then 1 of the 3 exam questions in the actual exam would be new. So that's the rule. Okay, and then yeah, so I mean next week also, if you have any questions regarding the midterm, just let me know. Okay, so that's the logistics. And okay, so let's continue our comparative politics part. So last week we focused mostly on the legislative, and now we're moving on to executive and also judiciary and bureaucracy. But the thing is, last week actually, towards the second half of the class, we have been talking about the relationship between the legislative and the executive. So in a sense, we have been already started talking about the executive. But one thing, before I move on, one thing I'd like to make some correction or clarification is that last week when we talked about the French case, so I went back and checked. So basically, for here in Taiwan, I mean, of course, nowadays we so in most of the political science literature, Taiwan is now classified under semi-presidentialism, and as I also explained, one of the I think the controversies surrounding the interpretation of this system is that the model, of course, we learned that from the French model, but we also have some critical differences from the French model. And one of the key differences that has caught a lot of people's attention is that in France they have had 3 times of cohabitation. But why with a similar institutional setup here in Taiwan we never had any cohabitation here, right? So in other words, there were cases when here in Taiwan, when president actually lost the majority in the Congress. So in the French example, we mentioned 2 in last week, right? First is the Mitterrand was the Chirac, and second is Balladur, and also okay, so Mitterrand and Balladur. So basically, the French president back then, was sort of forced to appoint someone from the other party, right? The party that actually had a majority in the Congress. But here in Taiwan, the first time was, I think, back to 2000, when former President Chen Shui-bian won the election. He was, of course, from the DPP, but the majority in the Congress back then was KMT. But he appointed someone who actually was previously KMT, but was actually an independent when he joined the cabinet or became the prime minister. And therefore, Chen Shui-bian, for that example, didn't actually, follow the French example to choose someone from KMT. And KMT also didn't, want to join the coalition either. So that was the first time. And now we have a second example where, the coming president, William Lai, he also, basically DPP also has lost the majority in the Congress. But obviously, even though we haven't, of course, known the answer to that, but it seems that President Lai obviously is not going to appoint someone from KMT, but we don't know who that goes to be, right? So the point is, but the thing is, one of the key conditions here is in the Constitution, before 1997, the ROC Constitution actually stipulated that the Congress or the legislature here, legislative yuan, had the power to approve the nominee of the prime minister. But that power was removed in 1997. So after 1997, the president can basically nominate anyone he or she likes. And institutionally, they don't need approval from the Congress. Okay? But in the French case, in the Constitution, there's also no requirement for the president to get approval from the Congress. But nonetheless, And that's why, I mean, in the Chinese literature, I mean, a lot of Chinese scholars previously, I think, have been trying hard to explain why there is such a difference. And they have come up with a couple of reasons. I think one of the reasons is that I think the executive power in the French in the French system, the prime minister has much more power compared to Taiwanese prime minister. And that's the reason why here in Taiwan, it's hard for the prime minister to be an independent source of power. Even though, as I said, I mean, the key point here, we explained last week that there could be a switch or alternation, I mean, depending on how you call that. There could be, that's why, even in the English literature, we tend to call this system semi-presidential. But here, some people, there's no official translation, right? Because that's not the term we use in English literature. But the meaning is, some people call this system like a dual leader, something like that. So you have actually two different executive powers represented by the president and the prime minister. And depending on who owns the majority in the Congress, which one, one of them would be the real person in power. So that's like a French system where, when actually in a cohabitation, the prime minister is much more powerful and then is viewed as the head of the government internationally because he's a person or she's a person who can actually cause a shot. And because, without the majority in the Congress, the government basically cannot pass any laws. So that's basically means that you cannot govern, right? But here in Taiwan, I mean, we don't simply have that kind of constitutional convention. And therefore, and they can still manage to govern. I mean, even though, as you might probably learn that before, under Chen Shui-bian's 8 years, the DPP always complain they cannot do much because the KMT control the majority in the Congress and therefore always block a lot of bills they wanted. So that's something that we have to know. So in other words, the correction is that both the French and Taiwanese systems, they don't require the approval from the Congress regarding the appointment of the prime minister. Nonetheless, you still have these two different, very different way of, different way of operation inside the system. So the president here, I mean, I suppose that kind of convention will continue. That William Lai probably won't appoint someone from the KMT. So I mean, we can wait and see, but it's coming, right? He's going to be sworn in May, so we'll see the answer there. Okay, so that's something I would like to clarify from last week. All right, and then but we want to continue to explore a little bit especially we focused on the executive today, and especially the differences between the parliamentarism and presidentialism, and because as I'm going to show you through again a very simple model, it's very interesting that all these institutional differences, they are not just important in terms of the how we describe these different systems, but also these different institutional designs have different policy implications. And let me start from this very simple chart. And the thing is, we haven't gone to that part about political economy, right? This part still is comparative politics, but this is like a prelude to that. And the reason is, as we're going to make it even more clear, in 2 weeks when we get to the political economy part. So all these interesting differences in institutional designs, they have important policy implications and or economic consequences. And so it's worthwhile, like mentioned here, different designs, because of there are different answers to some of the key questions. We will find, for example, one of the simple conclusions we're going to draw in a minute is that presidentialism actually would have lower rents. And I'm going to go through again also to talk to you about the details, about the concept of the rents, and then we can, go to that simple model. So, well, in this very simple schema, was like a circle, right? And it's also, I would say, a very fundamental model for understanding the interactions between, politics and the economy. and especially the government policies. So on the political side, every country, of course, has constitutions. And so their constitutional rules will, of course, lead to certain political consequences, especially there are a couple of key questions here. The constitutional rules will tell you which rules and also whose preferences, because there are all kinds of different actors inside the political system. And we started from veto player theories at the beginning of the semester, and you know that, well, we started from simply counting the number of veto players. And for today, we're going to talk about, if these different veto players, they have different roles to play in a system, and then you will actually have a very different policy implications, and especially economic consequences. So when we analyze policymaking, we always have to go through these steps. So we have to go to the Constitution to see, which rules matter and whose preferences matter. And inside the government, in different government forms, they would decide who would make decisions inside the system. And here, this is the striking difference between the two, between parliamentarism and presidentialism. Under parliamentarism, the prime ministers, they need to maintain legislative majority to stay in power all the time, right? It's very intuitive. Once they lost the majority in the Congress, then that basically means they lost the foundation of their power, when it came into the government. But this is not the case. Under presidentialism, and I think we also mentioned this for a couple of different times, presidents and legislative or Congress, they enjoy independent sources of legitimacy. They have their own elections, and they actually have their own tenures, and they are protected by their tenures. So in other words, put it simply, by contrast, presidents don't need to maintain such a majority in the Congress, and they can maintain power. But that's, of course, lead to something we talked about last week, the divided government, right? You could have, so that's actually what we're experiencing right now, right? The executive belongs to one party, but the legislative majority belongs to the other. And therefore, of course, these two different parties, of course, they have different policy agenda and different preferences, and therefore they always be in conflict. Okay, so we're going to focus on this difference. And but something else that we have to talk about, maybe not that much today, but we'll be talking more about this in the political economy part, is that all these decisions, they're going to determine different regulations in the market. And the market, of course, will give you economic consequences. In other words, who are the winners, who are the losers. And all these winners and losers, they might have different policy preferences. And then they will, again, the information will be fed into the constitutional rules. So there'll be like a cycle. But the point here is, no matter what kind of economic consequences we have on this side, what we are going to focus today is how the differences in the institutional design are going to process these differences in different ways. So it's a bit like a production process, right? You have inputs, and then the inputs go through machines, and then you have outputs. So what we're talking about today is like different designs or structures in those machines. And those differences are critical for determining the policymaking. And okay, so this is kind of basic, kind of fundamental structure we have for today. And then let's move on to some of the key concepts. So this is actually, as I said, a prelude to the political economy parts, because these concepts are from the political economy literature. So the first one is the concept of rents. All right. So of course we understand what rents are, but in economics we have a specific definition for that. So, well, in terms of its definition, rents refer to the income in excess of opportunity costs or competitive price. So I'm going to have just a few figures for you to understand that. But basically, it means that well, I mean, ideally, if you are in a perfect competition, in a perfect market, and of course you will reach a particular price. So rents is a concept where we use to describe any differences either below or above that market price. Because what is interesting, of course, is not there is such a difference. The interesting thing is, how does this come about? Why do we have such, difference, right? And in either economics or political science, we create all kinds of different theories to teach us, how the rents are generated. What is even more interesting, of course, is that, rents, if we refer rents just to any income in excess of competitive price, then in politics, as I'm going to show you very clearly, if you have rents in the market, then politicians, they're going to seek rents. The reason is the rents, of course, I mean, maybe another way to talk about rents is that these are distortions, right? So in economics, we try to model a lot of different situations and try to find what are the most efficient solutions, right? The solutions that bring people the highest level of social welfare or highest utility, right? So that's something we call economic efficiency. And in the real world, the perfect market never exists, right? So there are all kinds of distortions there. So there could be economic distortions, but what is interesting for us is that there are also political distortions, which means governments sometimes they would design very inefficient policies and waste resources. So things could have been very different. Things could have been more efficient, but because of these policies, you have waste of resources. But the thing is, you might think, why do we have to stand up? Why would we have to put up with all these inefficiencies? And the reason is, and because we have governments in the world. And that's also the reason why in neoclassic economics, you only have a few roles for government to play. And governments actually are not something they appreciate a lot. And that's in the politics, because the incentive structure for all the politicians are different. What are their incentive structures? They want to get reelected, right? Because politicians, especially in democracies, can only serve for a fixed term of years, 4 years, 3 years, 5 years. And once their time is up, then they will have to look for opportunities for them to get reelected because they want to stay in power. So this incentive is very different from market behavior, and therefore, it's complicated. But I'll tell you the details in a bit. But the thing is, there are lots of rent-seeking behaviors in politics, and that's the reason why we want to talk about rents. And another concept is residual claimants or residual claim. This is also from economics that in business terms, residual claim refers to the rights of shareholders to the remaining assets once the fixed claims on a business have been met. And of course, what are these fixed claims? Well, for example, if you run a business, you produce something, of course you have to buy intermediary goods, right? But when you buy all these things, these are your costs, right? So you have to pay your suppliers, right? And also your labor costs. If you want to produce something, you have to hire workers, and you have to pay your workers, your employees. So there are labor costs. And also, if you borrow money from banks, you have interest rate, and you have interest to pay, to those banks, right? And then you have to pay the government for taxes. So you have all these fixed claims. These are claims made by other players in the market. Either it's your suppliers or the banks or your workers or the governments, right? So residuals means that once you have deducted all these costs and the remaining part, maybe a more intuitive way of calling this is what? Your profit, right? Your profit, your net profit. When you take away all these costs, then what's left is your profit, right? And therefore, in business context, the residual claimants, they're like shareholders, right? They have legitimate claims over these residuals or profits, and therefore, what's their incentive? If you are a shareholder, if you buy stocks in the future, Of course, you want a company to prosper, right? You want a company, make more money so you can have more shares, right? So your incentive is to maximize the profits of the company. That's what residual claimants are about to do or wanted for, right? But in politics, it's not going to be good. And the reason is we want to identify who are residual claimants in politics. And when we define these people as residual claimants, through different institutional designs, these people are going to have the power to determine the rents and also the allocation of rents to different people. So a few things that we have to talk about these residual claimants in politics. First of all, these people, they will have strong incentive in seeking rents. Okay, so sometimes, I'm not sure if until now you have a clear sense of what rents are. A more brutal way of calling this is that it's like corruption. But sometimes some corruption is legal, some corruption is not legal, right? If you, this happens a lot. The thing is, we just talk about trade negotiations, right? And we, of course, this is not a class about international political economy or international economics, so we won't have a chance to talk about that. But trade policy, for example, is a perfect it's a perfect example where a lot of rents are created. Why? Well, we buy a lot of things imported from foreign countries. And of course, you probably see that, what I know is that, a long time ago, Taiwanese government imposed a very high tariffs on cars. And that's why a lot of, foreign cars were especially expensive, right? A lot of luxurious sports car, like, Beamer, or the Mercedes-Benz. So these are this is like the symbols of status in Taiwan for quite a while. And the reason is these are very expensive cars. If you can buy them, that means that you are rich. But of course, these are good cars, right? And that's why they are rich. They're expensive. But the problem is, it's not just about the quality of the car itself. It's also about what? It's also about tariffs. If governments decide to protect their own car industries in their countries, they sometimes can impose tariffs because that will raise the prices of foreign goods to a great extent. And therefore, that essentially create a market for those local automakers, right? Suppose if those local automakers cannot make good cars like, Mercedes and Beamer, what they can count on is their prices, right? They can actually, sell low-end cars with low prices. And because the government intentionally raises the prices for foreign cars, and therefore a lot of people here in Taiwan, they cannot afford foreign cars and they have to choose domestic cars. And if you are a consumer, are you going to be happy about this? Probably not, right? Because even though I'm not rich, but maybe I'm rich enough to buy Beamer in foreign countries. If I go to other countries, maybe I have enough money to buy those cars. And now just simply because I live here and because the government's policy, I cannot buy. And so this is the very typical example of using trade policy as a tool, either to protect local industries, or there's another way to call it, to create rents, right? Because, I guess if you understand what I'm talking about, maybe the next question you want to ask is, then why do you want to protect your local industries? Could you come up with any reasons for doing that? It could be nationalism, right? We want our own cars. Do you have that kind of sense? I don't know. We use a lot of goods produced in the foreign countries, but we have no problem with that. But maybe, some government officials, they have this sense of nationalism. They want to have their own cars. But that's of course, a good way to describe this kind of incentive. But there's another way to describe such incentive, which is it's just because you have lots of inefficient local producers. Without all these protections, they will be driven out of business because they cannot compete with other foreign cars. And what is even worse is that if you are talking about a democracy, these local producers sometimes can make contributions to politicians. And you probably know that, well, even here in Taiwan, I'm not talking about the United States, right? Because in the US, this is very typical. But here in Taiwan too, right? Large business companies, they make donations to politicians. And, politics is expensive. If you want to try, I don't know, maybe, we have, for example, like, this is the 10th anniversary of the Sunflower Student Movements. And, a lot of leaders, student leaders back then, they were students here. And you can imagine that if you have no part, zero background in politics, and you want to become a candidate running for a particular election, it's very difficult because you have lots of things you have to pay, right? Your ads, your commercials, and the people working for you. And these are all expensive. And therefore, a lot of times, politicians, of course, they will receive sometimes subsidies from the government, but also they receive donations from, big businesses. And therefore, the story line is such that all these local producers, they might actually make contributions to the government officials who, want to get reelected next time. And therefore, in exchange, these politicians, because they have power over policymaking, so they make policies to protect these local producers. But that's actually, something we call a special interest politics. And that happens a lot in the US and also in other democracies as well. But let's put that aside, because I just use that as an example to tell you, in politics, our job now is to identify who these residual claimants are. And then, because they have very different incentive structures compared to other players in politics. And also, if you have a lot of these kind of residual claimants in politics, well, in a particular institution, then that institution obviously might actually have more rents compared to other institutions without these many residual claimants, all right? And to also use the term we have been using for quite a while, so when they are also middle players in an institution, they will also have the power to create rents. So there are two very critical concepts here. First of all, we have to understand rents. That rents basically are political distortions of economic efficiencies, all right? And second, in politics, what is even, I guess, sometimes worse is that, well, inside political systems, there are different players there. If they are residual claimants, they will try to use their power to create rents for themselves. And we use these two concepts to compare presidentialism and parliamentarism, as we will see in a bit. But before that, as I said, what are rents? These are easy easy graphs for showing. So how are rents created? So suppose initially you have this very simple supply-demand curve, and then of course, with the at the intersection you have the equilibrium price and quantity, right? So the P0, Q0, this is the initial price and quantity. It's just equilibrium in a perfect competition market. So now, suppose you have intervention from the governments, and the government decides to impose the policy to lower the price. It happens sometimes, especially when a country is hit by inflation. So sometimes, to cure or to fight against inflation, it's not to use a policy simply to lower the price, because that's going to backlash a lot. So we'll see that. So suppose now you have a government intervention to lower the price from P0 to PG. And what's going to happen next is that with the new price PG on the market, but that's of course the nominal market, but people will respond to the market prices with different, reactions. And what's happening is that once you have this new PG, and then we can identify the two quantities here for demand and supply. So because of the price, it has been lower, so we have actually more demand. It's going to grow from Q0D to Q1D. But then because of the lower price, then you have less incentive for the suppliers to produce, and therefore the new supply will be moved from Q0S to Q1S. And such a policy, in the end, results in scarcity of the goods. And next, because of scarcity, this is a new supply. This is a new supply, right? And actually, it's going to result in the new price in the actual market, not a nominal market. Well, this is like, for example, in finance. I mean, public finance, governments can actually determine the interest rates, but that's for nominal interest rates. But in the actual black markets, you might have different interest rates. There's a gap between them, and this is like that. So you can actually specify a particular policy like P1G. But because of the economic consequences of such a policy, you're actually going to have a new price induced by the scarcity. And now it's going to be P star. And then this new equilibrium, P star as a price and QS1 as the quantity produced in the market. And so in terms of how we describe rents, the difference between P star and P zero, this is what we call rents. This is how rent is created, right? Because this is, again, as we just said, right? Rents is such a thing, is an income in excess of the competitive price. The competitive price before was P0. And therefore the rents is actually a term to describe the difference between them. And of course, from the pure perspective of this context, this is inefficient. Without the government policy, you have P0 as the efficient, equilibrium. But with the policy, it's counterproductive. The price actually goes up to P star, and then you actually create rents for the society. All right, so maybe I should stop here for a while. So, I mean, any questions regarding this, the idea of the rents? Yeah. Well, yeah. So it's actually, if you go back to the example of trade policy, when such a rents, of course, rents can be created in many different ways. This is one of them. And for the tariff example, who gets the rent? Maybe, well, I mean, there's actually a nice way of doing this, but now let's just describe this in words. When governments manipulates prices, the market, of course, will respond, and then you might have this kind of rents created. But in the tariff context, one of them who gets the rents would be the local producers, right? Because previously, they cannot compete with foreign cars, so they lose the market. And now, because of this protection, a lot of people, they cannot afford buying foreign cars, and they have to, buy local cars instead. And you get additional revenues from those consumption, right? And that's one of the rents. It's not efficient because the foreign cars were not that expensive previously. And now it becomes more expensive simply because the policy of the government. And the rents created also go to the politicians, right? Because you can see that interesting, the transaction nature of this. As I said, there's no reason for the government officials to do something out of no reason, right? So the way in which I describe it is that this is the political transactions between local producers and the government. The government officials do that because they need to get elected. They need money to run campaign. And therefore, the local producers, they make donations to the politicians at the beginning, right? And then in exchange, the officials, because of their power, they make such a policy. They impose tariffs to raise the prices of foreign cars. And the effect of that is local producers are able to have a new market. The new market is composed of those people who cannot afford buying a foreign car, given this price change. So is that clear enough? So these are where the rents go to. And this is a huge topic in political science or political economy in particular, because we see a lot of examples of politicians creating rents for themselves. And it's because they need to get elected, it's because they, sometimes, of course, it's simply for personal purposes, self-serving. So is that clear enough? Other questions? Not to consumers. Consumers, they are losers. Because what you lose because you have to pay more to buy things you want, or you have to suffer from lower quality products, right? If you, for example, I don't know, I mean, nowadays, I mean, we're in this very globalized world, so a lot of things are created in different parts of the country, right? Like this laptop, it's supposedly this is a product of the United States, but it's assembled somewhere in China, right? And a lot of parts inside these laptops are produced in different places. But the thing is, if the government here decides to impose tariffs on the computer, on Mac, and then of course we have to, I would have to suffer. I cannot use other things. I'm so used to Mac, right? So I have to suffer, or have to pay more. So as a consumer, we all lose. We all lose. I mean, and also in economic terms, it's also sacrifices social welfare because we all have to pay more price, pay higher prices to buy things we don't have to. And the beneficiaries include, of course, politicians and those local producers. But this is, of course, when we contextualize this in tariffs. So we're talking about tariffs trade policy. But there are other examples, or there are other ways we could talk about this as well. So other questions? All right, so then let's move on. Okay, so then let's come back to our focus today. So after we have introduced these concepts. So as I said, what is interesting, I think this, I don't know, when I first read this, I think this is exciting, right? So we have very, handy and useful concepts for describing all these differences. So under parliamentarism, and as we just mentioned, the prime ministers, they have to maintain a majority coalition inside the Congress, right? Otherwise, they would lose power. And so essentially, these coalition members, they are residual claimants. They have claimed over those rents. They have power to claim those rents, and they have power to allocate the resources. And what is even, worse under parliamentarism is that because there's a fusion of power, and we have been talking about this for also several times. There's no separation of powers between executive and legislative under parliamentarism, and therefore, this point is going to be much clearer when we make the contrast between parliamentarism and the presidentialism. Because under separation of powers, well, as I'm going to show you, you could have lower government spending and also lower rents created. And the reason is simply because inside the presidentialism or inside any system with separation of powers, not every player is a residual claimant. When you are residual claimants, you have incentive to create rents because you get more for yourselves, right? And you have a chance to do that. But if you have smaller number of residual claimants inside a system, then actually, it's very automatic, or very intuitive that you will have lower rents because there's no way for, you don't have so many people who have powers and incentive to do that. So let's start from, let's begin this very simple model. It's not too complicated, but I think eventually we can derive some interesting results for understanding how the socially optimal solutions can be adopted. And for the beginning, the core question in this simple model is the resource allocation between public goods and rents. And these are two important, again, concepts from economics, and they have very useful applications in political science as well. So first of all, I'm not sure you have learned this already, but let me just also very quickly explain to you. So public goods, what are public goods? So there are two major properties of public goods. So sometimes, most of the things are private goods, right? We pay producers to buy all these things. These are private goods. We own these goods. But in our lives, there are also lots of different public goods, like what we are doing here. Education itself is a public goods, right? But the two major properties, one is public goods are non-excludable, so they can be enjoyed, supposedly to be enjoyed by most people, all people, not most people. That's why it's public. So you cannot exclude other people from enjoying public goods. So do you know what other examples of public goods? Like infrastructure, roads, right? So you cannot exclude, right? That's right. So you cannot exclude other people from using the roads, right? And or national defense, right? This is another very typical example of public goods. But there's another property, non-rivalry. So some public goods are non-rival. So in other words, my use or your use of the good does not diminish your or our or my access to it. So it has to be for some public goods, they are both non-excludable and non-rival. But the thing is that always the case? Is that always the case? Non-rivalry? Well, just like example you gave us, roads or parks, those infrastructures, they are public goods because, for example, everyone can drive, his or her car on the road, and everyone can have access to the park, right? These are public goods. But because, if it's too crowded, for example, if there are too many people in the parks, or there are too many cars on the road, what's going to happen? Even though you have legitimate access to those goods, but the physicality means that if there are too many people or too many cars using those infrastructure, it simply in other words, it's not necessarily non-rival, right? There are lots of other examples of public goods that are not non-rival, but we don't, of course, here we are not. This is not a class about that. So about public economics. So I just want to say these are two major properties of public goods, and well, the key distinction here for us is not about this non-excludable and non-rival. It's about this. Public goods benefit by its nature, benefit all voters indiscriminately, while rents can only be enjoyed by policymakers. All right, so rents are always private. And all these politicians or local producers, they create rents for themselves, not to help others. And actually, as I just mentioned, if you have to pay much more, much higher price to buy something you used to buy, simply because of the tariff, then you are the loser. The policy is adopted at the price of your welfare, right? For the entire society, it's less efficient, but for individual consumers, it's this utility for you. So it's it's a competition actually. It's a zero-sum game, right? There's a trade-off here. Once you want to have more, and as I'm going to show you, in a bit, there's a trade-off actually between the provision of public goods and rent. And the reason is, well, the government can only, of course, there are some very predatory governments that take everything away from their people, but mostly it's very limited. You can tax people for what? 10%, 20%, right? And for some rich people, it's like 50% of their income, right? But the thing is, there's a limit to how much you can tax people. And so the pool is limited. And inside this pool, the politicians and the voters or consumers will have to compete. How much resources you're going to devote to public goods provision, and how much you're going to devote for your rents. So this is there's a trade-off here. But the thing is, that's why the contrast between the two is important here, because the resource allocation between the two will decide the benefits or welfare for individual consumers and also for individual politicians. And okay, so let me finish the next point, then we can take a break. So, and also in this model, we suppose there are n groups of voters in the society, and then next we're going to formalize these two different institutions. So let's take a break and come back at 10:20. All right, so let's come back for our second hour. So I just said there are N groups in a society, and then let's move on to formalizing to formalize the system. First of all, the presidential system, and then we can make a contrast with the parliamentarism. So of course we know the key feature of the presidential system would be a separation of powers. So we now have two major players. One is the executive represented by the president, we call that X, and then legislature, it could be Congress, denoted by L. And then, well, this is the key feature. This is how we specify the policymaking process. There are two stages. In the first stage, so the president will propose tax bill, but this proposal will need congressional approval. So it's the first stage. And second, but since you have separation of powers and of course checks and balances, and therefore the president can actually veto the Congress public goods or rents allocation proposal. So, well, you got to be a little bit careful here. So there are two stages and there are two kinds of proposals. The first proposal is president proposes how much tax you're going to levy, right? How much tax you're going to collect from the people, the tax rates basically, 10%, 15%, or 20%. And next stage will be for the Congress to decide. Once their entire pool, the size of the pool has been determined, the next, it will be the allocation of or between rents and public goods. So this is the power of the Congress. So this is, the way we design this decision-making process. And of course, what I have to say is that this might not be 100% consistent with the existing presidential systems. So, but this is by design a way to present to you there are indeed in a policy-making process two different stages, and people, or what I should say is institutions or organizations, president versus the Congress, they have two different kinds of powers, and president can veto the Congress as a way to check the power of the Congress, and president and Congress, they share rents, right? So suppose we have known already what rents are. So there are two different kinds of rents, Rx plus RL. Rx, of course, means that it's the rents for the president. RL is the rents for the Congress, and in total is R. And also we specify the default rent. This is the status quo. So default rents will be R bar X and R bar L. So Rx and RL would be something Congress would propose, as you could imagine that as a vector or as a set. But the existing level would be, the current level would be R bar X and R bar L. So these are default levels before anything changes. And then in contrast to the rents, there are also another, well, maybe it's not appropriate to call this rents, but this is the benefits from the office, right? Because the rents have to be created through policies, but these benefits, they are simply given to either Congress or presidents because they assume the position, and once they assume the position. So you can view that as like maybe the salaries, the government pays these people, and or the perks attached to these positions, but they are not rents, right? Because these are not something they have to create through policymaking. Okay, so but the thing is, the benefits we use capitalized R. These are, and this is important because one thing implicitly actually in the model, you have three different players, right? You have president, you have Congress. These are two major institutional players, but at the same time, you also have a player which is voters, right? Because they all have to look for re-election sometime. And then this is the pressure. If they have done good, it's more likely for them to get reelected. But if they've done bad, then of course that's not going to happen. So the benefits of this is important, right? This is R bigger, the capitalized R, Rx for the president, and capitalized RL for the Congress. So these are the incentives for them to stay in power. So in the following steps, you will see the constants, like references back to these different rents. So R is a rent, and as you can see that, well, public goods are good for people. So if you, as a politician, create a lot of public goods, of course, people will appreciate you, and then of course, give you another chance to stay in power, right? These are the kind of politicians we want. The kind of politician we don't want is someone who actually only think about, who only, thinks about his or her own benefits, right? Right. That's what rents are about. Rents are created for their private consumption, not for the public consumption. So only public goods can serve the benefits of everyone. Okay, so there's a constant contrast between these two because these two essentially, comprise the incentive structures or, compose. This is how their incentive structures are composed. There are two components. One is the rent, private rents. The other one is the rents with office. So bear in mind, this is a very important contrast. So, and then next. So next step, then of course, I just mentioned that you have three actors here, which is, explained the incentive structures for the president and Congress, but you also have voters, right? So for voters, as voters, we always want socially optimal solution. And this includes actually three different things. So the first one is the optimal tax rates will be tau star. So this is a Greek letter, tau star. At the same time, we also want zero rent. So R equals Rx and RL equals 0. So in other words, we don't want self-serving politicians to be in a position, right? And therefore, we want Rx and RL to be 0. And for the public goods, we want the level to be G star. So this is the, so tau star is a tax rate we want, is socially optimal tax rate, and G star is a socially optimal public goods provision. And then we want R to be 0. So this is, I suppose, all voters want a very capable politicians that can serve the the goods of everyone, right? There's a common goods and especially provision of public goods. Also, these voters, they vote retrospectively. What does that mean? It means that people vote on the basis of candidates' previous performance. So in a model, also we specify that voters will be able to observe both G and tau. But that's also intuitive, right? Of course, they have the information about that, and R as well. Of course, I mean, in the voting literature, there are different kinds of voting behavior. So we assume they vote retrospectively. So that's the important condition. So the voting decision is based on people's previous or candidates' previous performance. If they, as I said, if they have given us good level of public goods, then of course we'll vote for them. And so more formally, even though we are not going to play around with, we're going to play with this too much, but we can actually do this just for the sake of clarity. So this is how we specify the probabilities for them to win. So the probability for an incumbent candidate to win or to get elected can be given by its following function. So Pi will be equal to 1 if and only if W. Okay, I should have. So W means W is voters' utility, and Y is voters' income. So the incumbent candidates can only get elected P equals 1. So this is a very simplified situation where you only have the black and white, either 1 or 0. It's not like 20%, 30%, that kind of thing. So you can get elected if and only if the voters' utility is bigger or equal to Y minus tau star plus G star. So Y is of course voters' personal income, and so and of course voters pay taxes, and so that's tau star.
This is minus. The plus, if you create public goods for us, then that's a plus. So the G star is a plus. So if and only if the level of utility is above this optimal level or equal to this optimal level, otherwise, this politician is going to lose the election. Okay, so that's the second case. It equals 0 if your utility is lower than that level. Okay, so in other words, this is a simplified scenario where a politician can only get elected when this person offers the socially optimal solution. If this person fails to do that, then this person won't get elected anyway. And next, also, there is a competition, but not just competition, but also cooperation between president and Congress. How is that a case? So first of all, as we have explained, they are in actually the zero-sum competition for rents, right? Because there are two stages. At the first stage, the tax rate has been determined. And once the tax rate is determined, it means that you have this much government revenue to use, right? And then this is a fixed amount. There's a fixed amount here, given the particular level of the tax rate. And so, in other words, when you move down to the second stage, where the Congress decides how to allocate these resources, it's in a zero-sum competition. Either the president gets more or the Congress gets more. So it's zero-sum. But the thing is, this is not only dynamic. This is the interesting part. Because, well, what is interesting about this game is that, of course, we're not just simply talk about rent seeking, right? We're also talking about the possibility for these people to get reelected. To get reelected, we just specify the probability, and therefore, if you don't contribute to the social welfare, there's no way for you to get reelected. So in other words, they don't just care about the level of rents. They might also care about policies. Because the policies here has two components, right? One is the tax rates. So for voters, from the perspective of the voters, so how much money I have to pay for the tax, right? So the first policy. But the second policy is what? Is public goods, right? Because in my decision to vote or not to vote for you, I have to look at the public goods, right? And it has to be G star for me to vote for you. So, which means if the president and Congress, of course, this is a collective, kind of personified way to use to call this. And Congress is a lot of different people, but we just simplify it to a single person. So a collective person. So if the president and Congress, they want to get reelected, then they need to adopt particular kind of policies to do that, right? So that also means they have to cooperate because, as I just said, there are two stages. President make the decision in the first stage, but the Congress gets to make the decision in the second stage. So either way, and then the tau and G, they're determined at two different stages. So they have to cooperate. Otherwise, they might not get elected from the very beginning. Okay, so next, let me go through the timeline. Sorry. All right, so the timeline this is sometimes we call the sequential game. In other words, the game proceeds in different, steps. So there are 5 stages, even though, I just call that there are 2 stages, but we further divide these 2 stages into 5. And in each stage, of course, different actors will have a role to play. So in the first stage, as I said, President X proposes a tax bill tau. All right, this is the first stage. And then, why? Sorry, I have to move this for them. So and then, when it comes to the second stage, after the president proposed the tax bill, the bill is sent to Congress, right? So in the second stage, Congress L then votes, right? Yay or nay, right? So either the bill got passed and then tau is adopted as a tax rate, or it is rejected. And then we go back to the default level, which is bar, tau bar. So everything, so in a model, everything with a bar on it notes to something default or something, in a current situation, in a current, the status quo. So in the second stage, Congress votes and decides whether they want to pass the bill or reject the bill. And that will also decide whether it's tau or tau bar that is adopted. And so for the first two stage, this is what we call the tax determination, right? Or this is the first stage we talked about in the previous slides, but now we divide it into two different stages. And starting from stage 3, we move on to another stage where the public goods are determined. So, okay, stage 3. So the Congresses at this point, and I'll explain. So if this proposal is rejected, then of course everything stops there. You just go back to the original. Well, but if it's get passed, then we move on to the next stage, stage 3. So in this stage, Congress instead proposes a set of a vector of policies. There are 3 things. Tau is determined in stages 1 and 2, and starting from stage 3. So Congress proposes a level G, the level of public goods, and then the rents for herself, that's L, and the rents for president. So basically a vector of 3 different elements. And then move on to the next stage 4. And then, as I said, I mean, president, this is checks and balance, right? So actually, the president gets the power to decide whether he or she wants to veto the bill or not. So after this proposal is made, it was sent to the president, and the president decides whether to veto it. If president decides to veto it, then again, everything just goes back to the default level. So you'll be R bar L and R bar X. And then because tau has been decided, so the public goods would be the difference between the summation, the sum of R and R bar L and R bar X and the tau. And if president decides not to veto, and then G, R, L, and Rx will be adopted. And this is actually something we want to focus on. How to identify the conditions under which the socially optimal solution will be adopted. That's the question we're asking for the next steps of analysis. But there's a final stage, stage 5, as I mentioned, because voters also have a role to play. So at the final stage, stage 5, then you have election. And during the election, voters, they have observed both G and tau. And because this is the basis for their voting decisions, right? Because the voting decisions is based on the level G and tau. It has to be both at the optimal level, has to be G star and tau star. Okay, so the thing is, the way in which this kind of game is specified tells you what they care about in different stages. And eventually, as I said, so of course, politicians, I mean, this is a little bit, as I said, political economy. So we care about people's incentives. So people are incentivized to do something through tau. Tau gives you the entire, like the entire amount of the revenue for you to distribute, right? But then they are also attracted or incentivized by the level rents, okay? But at the same time, I guess the interesting part of this is that, of course, I mean, people want to be rich, right? That's why they want to either stay in power or they want more rents. But the thing is, you're under the constraint you're under the constraint that voters will have the power to decide whether you can stay in office or not. So at the final stage, voters would make the judgments whether to vote for you or not. So, well, as I probably said at the very beginning of doing this, this is, you can see how we actually use, contextualize all these interesting institutional details in a formal setting. We use a mathematical model, even though this is actually quite simple, but use this mathematical model to present all kinds of different situations. And we also have to care about whether these institutional features are incorporated, right? So we have incorporated, again, checks and balances, right? You have different powers in different stages. And you also have different variables or parameters to capture things that they care. So these are actually quite important. If you are interested in this kind of style of analysis, then this is some kind of details you want to pay attention to. All right, and then any questions? Anything that is not clear about here? All right. Okay, so next, then we can talk about how we continue, or sometimes we call this derivation, right? How we derive the final solutions. So one thing that we have to know is that factors determining presidents and Congress's actions. So first of all, they care about their own. They care about their own expected payoffs, right? So because all these different policies will give them different levels of payoffs, and they're incentivized by these payoffs, as I said. And next, they are also affected by, or their decisions are also shaped by their expectations of each other's actions. So what have other people done, right? So these are important factors for determining their actions. So, and again, one thing that maybe it's worthwhile talking about here is that this is a little bit game theory in a sense that, well, game theory is called game theory because it's very strategic. And everyone in a game, when this person makes a move, this person is going to take into account the other person's actions. That's why it's in a game setting, right? That's why it's strategic. But of course, there are other kinds of mathematical modeling that don't actually take this kind of strategic actions into account, because in some contexts, you just don't have such interactions. But here, we think this is important. But another thing is, when we do this derivation, is that we do this in backward. It's called a backward induction. Well, of course, you don't have to know too much about this, but I want to let you know this is the method we use and also why. So in a following analysis, we will begin with stage 4 and then work backwards towards stage 1. Why do we do that? And of course, this is the way in which all the game theoretical models do, because this is the way we derive the final equilibrium. And the reason is we use this method because this guarantees that each step is one's best response to the other's action. Okay, so the reason why we do this is that, again, this is because we, in such a game theoretical setting, we have to take interactions into account. So when we work backwards from the final stage, we can actually assume that or analyze different scenarios from the decision made from the previous stage. Okay, but this is, of course, still sounds pretty abstract, but let me do this and you can actually see how it is done. So if we work backwards, so we can start from, we should start from stage 3 and 4, right? Because this is the stage where right before election, and election, of course, it's something else. That's election, but so. Okay, so when we do this starting from stage 3 and 4, the tax rate, of course, has been already determined in stage 2. So we inherit, when we do this, we inherit the decisions made from the previous stage. So, and then if, this is a condition, if the socially optimal tax rate is chosen, which is tau equals tau star, right? So we don't know yet. And we want to derive different conditions under which this can happen. So we start from, so that's why we work, with different scenarios. So we start from this, suppose, if the socially optimal test rate is chosen, which means tau equals tau star, then there are two possible proposals. And of course, based on these proposals, we can, figure out their corresponding expected payoffs by Congress L in stage 3. So what are they? So the first scenario is that, G star. So in other words, remember, this is stage 3 and 4. So Congress makes a proposal about the allocation of resources. So suppose Congress is willing to propose such a fine thing. G star and then Rx equals 0 and RL equals 0. Remember, what is this? This is, of course, the socially optimal solution. And also, this is the only condition under which the Congress or the president can get elected, right? Because previously, when we specify the probability for someone to get elected, we say that the probability equals to 1 if you get this, right? The G star level of public goods, and also there are zero rents, all right? But what happens if this is the case? What happens, of course, in stage 5 is that the voters are very happy, and then of course, Congress get elected, and also the president get reelected. But we have to then know the expected payoffs for these people. So it will be very easy, the capitalized R, X for the president, and this is, as we said, capitalized R is the rent or the benefits from the office itself. So it's not about using policy to do something self-serving. And RL for Congress. So rents will be 0 in this case. So both Congress and presidents only get capitalized R for themselves, either bigger, capitalized RL or capitalized RX. But there's another possibility, right? There's another possibility where, well, essentially, they just take everything. The Congress just proposed something that would, grab everything. So when G equals 0, R equals Rx plus RL, and which is n times T star. Why is that the case? So we mentioned that there are n group in a society, and then times tau star, which is the test rate determined, because now we are working with the situation when tau equals tau star. So this is why the summation of both terms will be n tau star. And then, so in this case, of course, they both fail to get elected for disappointing voters, and they will divert everything from taxes collected. All right, so that's why Rx plus RL equals n tau star. And the expected payoffs, okay, for the president and for the Congress is this. So remember that at the stage 4, the president can veto this proposal, right? So you also have to give president something. Otherwise, this president is going to veto it. So because of that, but the thing is, of course, this action is going to make president unable to get elected. So Congress will have to share R bar X, which is a default level of the rent, with the president, and then the Congress herself will get n tau star minus R bar X. So this is just their expected payoff under this scenario. Okay, but one thing you might be wondering, I don't know. So now we only talk about 2 different scenarios, right? It's either G equals G star, or G equals 0, and then R equals n tau star. Why didn't I talk about other scenarios, like G equals something else? Do you know what? Do you know why? I didn't talk about like G equals A or B or C, and then Rx or RL equals something else. We only have to talk about these 2 things, and I will finish our analysis for now. Anyone? It's not that surprising, right? Because we just specified. The only way you get elected is that you have to give people this G star, RX0, RL0. For all the other possibilities, you fail. If you were the president, you were the Congress, why would you offer something to the voters? If I know I will fail the election anyway, right? If I give people some positive level of public goods, but the level is lower than G star, I still fail to get elected. Why should I do that? So, as a rational actor, it doesn't make sense. And therefore, there are only two possible scenarios. It's either they make voters happy and get elected, or they take everything. They'll take everything from the taxes they collected. So there are only two scenarios. And therefore, that would simplify, of course, our analysis a lot based on that. Okay, and then with this results, then we can continue to derive the condition under which the optimal level of solution can be adopted. So we already have two different scenarios. So for the Congress, the condition for the Congress to propose the socially optimal solution would be RL, which means that Congress gets re-elected, right? So it gets RL, and then the things on the right-hand side, n tau star minus R bar X, this is the payoff from the second scenario where they just basically grab everything. And this inequality 2 will be equivalent to this. This means that the things that they grab in total will have to be less or equal to the addition of these two things. One is the re-election incentive for the Congress, and the other one is the rent they pay to the president. So this is the first condition. So bear this in mind. We'll come back to use this condition next. But the thing is, this discussion is based on the premise that tau equals tau star. What about if tau doesn't equal tau star? So in this case, of course, if tau doesn't equal tau star, this means that at the stage 2, the president didn't propose the socially optimal tax rate. If that's the case, it becomes pretty simple because Congress will also fail to get elected, not just the president, right, for failing to offer tau star. The Congress will also fail to get elected for disappointing voters. And then, in this case, they will also divert everything from taxes collected. So, in other words, the situation is the same as the last step. So, which means we can only compare these two different quantities to get the condition we need. All right, so this is the condition 3. Okay, so this is stage 3 and 4. And as I said, we will work backwards from stage 3 and 4 to stage 1 and 2. So then let's move on. But before that, so any questions regarding this so far? All right. So next, let's move on from public goods determination to this, tax determination. So for the stage 1 and 2, so the condition for, what's the condition? But this is a question actually. Then what's the condition for president to propose the socially optimal tax rate, right? This is actually something we assumed, right? When we discussed stage 3 and 4, we said, suppose if president were to do this. Now, when we now move on to stage 1 and 2, we want to figure out the conditions for that to happen. So for that to happen, the condition for the president to do that, again, we can also discuss this in different scenarios. So if tau equals tau star and 3, the conditions I just mentioned is satisfied, then this means that Congress will propose the socially optimal solution, right? That's something we just mentioned. And then the payoff. So if this is the case, so if the president does this, tau equals tau star, and then the Congress also proposes something that is ideal, which is this, then the payoff for the president is that it will be Rx, because this is the case where president gets re-elected, right?
Okay. So if tau doesn't equals tau star, and then the present payoff would then become R bars X, right? This is something also determined previously when we talk about stage 3 and 4, right? So these are expected payoffs, all right? So again, when I mentioned that in such a game theoretical analysis, as a matter of fact, people take into account other, well, normally it's two, right? So it's the person here, and then the actor, the other actor. So because it's strategic. So in other words, when I make a decision, I will also take into account the other person's decision, potential decisions, right? But it's not just about this kind of horizontal interactions. It's also about like sometimes a temporal dimension here, because people make decisions based on their expectations of what might happen. So in this case, even though we are talking about stage 1 and 2, which is of course before stage 3 and 4, but when people make decision in this state, in these two stages, they also incorporate their expected payoffs from stage 3 and 4. So that's another sense of strategic interactions. So in this case, if tau doesn't equals tau star, of course, in this case, we know that president will fail and Congress will fail too, right? So that will go back to that G equals 0, right? And so in this case, as we just analyzed, the payoff for the president will be tau bars X. As a consequence, well, this one is easier. As a consequence, the condition for tau equals tau star would be just equation, oh, sorry, not equation, inequality 4. So which means Rx, capitalized Rx, will have to be bigger or equal to R bar X. Intuitively, this means that the incentive given by the office itself has to be bigger than the default level of rent. Okay, so intuitively, this is what this inequality means. So now we have two conditions already, inequality 3 and inequality 4. So these are two conditions we need for the socially optimal solution. So, but it's not done yet. And next, I don't know. Okay, and then of course we also have to think about, even now it's about stage 1 and 2, because we know after the president proposes the bill, the Congress gets to vote whether they want to accept the bill or not, right? So now we also have to talk about what is the condition for Congress L to accept the president's X proposal of socially optimal tax rates, tau equals tau star. And of course, if Congress rejects, then of course, then we know that everything goes back to the status quo. So nothing changes. So that's not something we want to talk about. And we know that that's going to happen with some positive probabilities. But if we are talking about the non-rejection situation, then there are two scenarios. One is if Congress depending on Congress's calculation, if Congress gives up re-election in stage 3, then the condition for accepting tau equals tau star is this inequality 5. So the thing on the left-hand side is n tau star minus R bar X. This is, if you remember, this is also the expression for the payoff for the Congress, and this is the expected payoff depending on which kind of tau you're expecting. So n tau star minus R bar X has to be bigger or equal to n tau bar minus R bar X. So this is when you accept the socially optimal solution, you get elected. And that's when you reject the socially optimal solution and you fail to get elected. And that's what you get from the next stage, 3 and 4. If this inequality, if this has to be satisfied, we can therefore, this is a typo, and therefore we can get this expression. So tau bar, the existing level of the tax rate, has to be less or equal to tau star, the optimal, socially optimal level. So this is
the equation, the inequality 6 is another very important condition for this to happen, for this social optimal solution to happen. So, and next, if Congress decides to propose something, because this first scenario is when Congress doesn't want to get elected, but if Congress decides to propose something that makes voters happy to get reelected, then this is only possible when tau equals tau star. Okay, so in other words, to conclude, from these two conditions, we know that as a consequence, no matter what choice Congress makes in stage 3, the condition for her to accept the socially optimal tax rate will be tau bar less than or equal to tau star, which is the inequality 6. So this is the condition we need. So up to this point, we have successfully established that there are 3 conditions that are critical for the socially optimal solution to take place. So let's move on to the final interpretations of all these results. So as a summary, the conditions for the socially optimal solution, tau star, G star, and then Rx equals RL equals 0 to be the equilibrium are, there are 2 conditions actually. One is the incumbents, in other words, the people who are in the positions before the election, the incumbents, they have to have strong enough incentive to pursue re-election, which means, well, this is specified in inequality 3 and 4. And well, intuitively, this means that, the bigger R, the capitalized R has to be big enough. So in other words, the benefits from the positions or offices themselves are attractive enough. So they don't want to do something to get extra little R. And then the second one is the default tax rate is lower. This is inequality 6, right? So this default tax rate is lower than the socially optimal tax rate. So Congress will approve the later in stage 2. So these are the conditions, and though it's intuitive enough for us to understand, the reasons for socially optimal solution to be adopted. But one thing that, the reason why we started all these analyses is that we want to understand the effects of those institutions, right? So then let's now take a step back and then, do something about that. So, and that's the only objective for us to do this. So the institutional effects of separation of powers, right? So when all the conditions are met, so we want to understand that. So first of all, since President X, well, this is actually a very critical concept. If we, after we went through all these steps, since President X can only propose a tax rate, and Congress L is the only residual, that means that Congress L is the only residual claimant. So in other words, in this whole setting of the game, there's actually a conflict of interest between Congress and voters. Well, again, so when we started out the analysis and mentioned this concept of the residual claimants in a business context, well, these are, I guess, of course, these are the important drivers of the company, right? It's because they want the company to grow bigger so they can share a larger amount of money, the profits, after they pay all the other fixed amounts, right? But in the political context here, especially in this discussion about the tax rates and public goods and rents, president, because it only has the power to propose the tax rate. It cannot even touch how the resources got allocated. So Congress L in this context is the only residual claimant. And also, let's finish this point. Since president also, so this is what I'm saying. The president has no power to do this. So in this setting, there is no conflict of interest between her and voters. So president can only gain positive payoff through staying in power, which is re-election. And this is why she's willing to propose the socially optimal tax rates. So you see that who is the bad guy, who is the good guy? In this setting, president is the only good guy here for the voters. And Congress always wants to take something for themselves. maybe not necessarily the case. I mean, depending on our discussion about these conditions, right? But the thing is, for now, you probably see the point right now, right? So the point is, we want to know, different incentive structures designed for president and Congress. And once we know these, we can tell you which one, the differences between parliamentarism and presidentialism. Because under parliamentarism, you don't have a president. You don't have someone who is not a residual claimant. But under presidential system, because of the checks and balances and also the separation of powers, you do have this. And one thing, let me finish this and then we can take a break. In a comparative politics literature, it's not like we're saying under parliamentarism there's no checks and balances. That's not the case. But that's something we call the vertical checks and balances. Because even under parliamentarism, given a certain period of time, every politician has to subject to the voters, to the elections, So in other words, it's a vertical one because the Congress or, the fusion of power, the Congress and the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, they are the people in power, but they are held accountable to voters given election. So it's vertical. But in the presidential system, it's horizontal because by design, in a presidential system, you have different institutions set up to check each other. So that's what we call the horizontal checks and balances. So here, what we can say is that, well, under parliamentarism, this vertical checks and balances might not work that well compared to horizontal checks and balances, where you actually have, people who are not residual claimants, and therefore they have stronger incentive to stay in power, and therefore they have to do something to satisfy voters. All right, so let's take a break for 10 minutes and come back at 23. Okay, so let's come back for our final hour. So we were at here, interpretations. So let me see. Okay, so we were here at point 2, comparing basically the roles between the president and Congress, because Congress is the only residual claimant here in this game, and president because she has no power to allocate a residual. So in that sense, she has no conflict of interest with voters, and so president can only have positive payout to stay in power. So I think. Well, I hope I can get this message across very strongly, in the sense that, I mean, through all the analyses, I think that the point is there's a constant, contrast between two things. One is the rents, right? The small r, Rx and RL, that's only enjoyed privately by either president or Congress, right? And well, as I said, political economy, even though we're going to officially introduce the topic to you in 2 weeks. But the major, I would say, the reason why people want to study this kind of stuff is that we understand that we can delegate a lot of powers to the government. Of course, we cannot change that. We don't want to live in anarchy, right? But the problem is precisely because of this delegation, we delegated power to politicians, and with that power, politicians can do a lot of things to hurt the country and hurt the people. So all these political economy analysis is a way to tell us under what conditions can this kind of situation prevent this situation from happening. And therefore here we know a little bit about through the analysis, comparing parliamentarism and the presidential, even though this is a presidential system with president and Congress. But we know that how can we stop Congress from doing something bad, right? And because Congress here is a residual claimant, so Congress has incentive and has the power to do this. So the president, president doesn't have, and president can only have benefits through staying in power. So that's the second source I'm talking about. The first source is this because the delegation of power, they use the power to adopt bad policies that hurt the country but benefit themselves. But if they have incentives for getting reelected, which means they want to stay in power, and to stay in power, what's the price to pay? As far as this game is concerned, the price to pay is that they have to adopt a policy that make voters happy. And the only thing that can happen is that you adopt a policy set with G star, tau star, Rx, and RL equals 0. So these are only conditions under which this can happen. So this is, so in other words, I mean, as I say, I mean, the game is all about, which source eventually becomes more attractive to them. And then if they are attracted to this part, then of course they always adopt something that pleases voters and not themselves. Okay. So next step, so of course, and then as I said from the very beginning, I mean, we want to know the difference between parliamentarism and presidentialism, and so without separation of powers or horizontal checks and balances, the incumbents are pure residual requirements, and this is the case, of course, under parliamentarism. And these residual requirements, they have a direct conflict of interest with voters. And so that, a little bit about the details. So without separation of powers, so even though the incentive for re-election is equally strong, so in other words, R remains the same, the institution has no one inside who can only be rewarded through re-election like president. So even though I have to say, if you want to make comparisons across, between presidentialism and parliamentarism, things sometimes might not be this simple. But this is the reason for doing this kind of analysis, right? We want to focus on particular factors. So in this case, we focus on institutions. So by design, so that's why we always, I want to emphasize always, by design, even though if the incentive for election is equally strong across different institutions, and R remains the same across them, but the point is, by design, presidentialism or other similar institutions, they put someone inside the system that is not residual requirements, and it can only be rewarded through re-election like a president. And this is the way in which we can actually make politicians more accountable to voters. And under the scenario, of course, without separation of powers, actually what happens sometimes is that incumbent can get reelected even with positive rates. And the reason is, well, I mean, this is a little bit interesting in the sense that, well, suppose the incumbent threatens to divert all the income, like tau equals NY. Voters would then give the incumbent a certain amount of rents to avoid such situation from taking place. So, of course, this is something we didn't analyze in this case, but the thing is, what we imply here is that if you, in a system without separation of powers, the incumbent sometimes can still get elected, right? With certain rents of power, certain levels of rents. And of course, that's bad. And that's why going back to the conclusion I drew several slides ago, compared to presidentialism, parliamentarism might have higher level rents. And with that, of course, a higher level of government spending, because that implies more policies and more policies that are adapted to create more rents. Okay, without policies, I mean, there are no rents created. So that's kind of like the conclusion from the analysis so far. So it took longer than I thought, but I guess it's probably also better for you to understand the details. So any questions? Any questions regarding this? No? It's probably not true, but anyway, so, I mean, if you have any questions, just email me or we can talk later. All right, so if you don't have any questions for now, then let's move quickly to the next topic, bureaucracies. So of course, I mean, bureaucracies are part of the executive power, right? But they're different because bureaucracies for bureaucrats, they don't have to be subject to elections. They're not elected, right? So if you want to be a bureaucrat, I mean, you just take exams, right? So bureaucrats, bureaucracy is a separate topic, and we want to talk about some of them here. But always, when we talk about bureaucracies, we always start from Max Weber's very classic definition, and well, because through that, we can understand, some of the key features of a bureaucracy, and also, but what I want to emphasize more, however, after this is that bureaucracies or independent or autonomous bureaucracies are actually linked to other things and other more interesting and important political outcomes, and I will talk about them in a bit. But first of all, I think it's worthwhile just going through. Especially this is summarized. These are all summarized in the textbook. So eight different features of a bureaucracy. So compared to other organizations, a bureaucracy or administrative offices, they are organized in a hierarchy, right? So, for example, if you want to take the exam to be a diplomat in the future and working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, once you get into that, you know that it's a hierarchy, so you have to climb up the ladder over time. So, it's different from other like companies or private organizations. Sometimes there's lower level of hierarchy, and or you can actually become in your early stage become the leader inside the organization. But for a bureaucracy, it will take quite a long time to do that. And here on campus too, we can see that the professors, they all have different titles and they all represent different levels or different ranks. So this is what the bureaucracy looks like. It's hierarchical, but it's hierarchical for some reason, and we'll talk about them later. So second, each office has its own area of competence. So in other words, compared to politicians, sometimes the contrast is so obvious. Most politicians have no expertise at all. If you want to ask them, what are you good at? They don't know. So that's why I think it's always an interesting question that you might get asked that, because you're a poli-sci major, do you want to run for election or not be a politician later? But well, that's a nonsense, right? I mean, but anyone can be a politician, right? And so, but bureaucrats is different. If you want to be a bureaucrat, and here in Taiwan and other countries too, right? You have to take certain exams. And those exams are tests of your expertise or your professional abilities or competence, whether you are competent to do the job. So, but for politicians, it's hard to say how competent they are, right? It's hard to define the competence, right? You want to say, well, okay, so even the president, different presidents has different personalities and different competence. So it's hard to define what, for a particular office. But for bureaucracy, it's different. So each office, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for Foreign Affairs means that you are, especially good at, knowing international politics, or you're good at. So it's a profession in itself. So that's why it's defined by its competence. And third, civil servants, they are appointed, not selected, on the basis of technical qualifications as determined by diplomas and examinations. So this is a little bit of a repetition of that. So even though it might mean different things because competence might not necessarily be measured through exams, but in many cases, that's the case. So they're appointed, not selected, because when you say selected, it seems that there's someone up there, the superior officers, they use their personal will to select someone to be in office. But that's not the case in a bureaucracy, because all the civil servants, you have to pass certain exams, and this exam is a basis for people to judge. You do have this technical qualification, and or you have a diploma. So for example, if you want to be a doctor, for example, or you have to go through medical school and then take exam to get to get the license. So that's the feature of a bureaucrat. And next, civil servants, they receive fixed salaries according to rank. Okay, so this is, I don't know, I mean, nowadays, one thing I have been always surprised at is nowadays, it seems that some people at least, to tend to envy the careers of bureaucrats, right? Once you pass exam, people will congratulate you, right? But it's like, when I was undergrad, I mean, it's not actually the top choice for NTU students to be a bureaucrat. We actually look down on people who do that. But now it's the reverse. It's interesting. But anyway, but the thing is, civil servants now, I guess that's because the country's economy has become more, I don't know, more fluctuated. So people might not have that much confidence in joining private sector. So they're more willing to take exams and to become civil servants. And the good thing about civil servants is that you have a very stable stream of income, right? It's not like private sectors. You might got fired, you might got, salary reduction. But for civil servants, because they are all specified by law. So how much you can earn given your rank. And therefore it's very stable, and and government always pay you on time, but it's fixed. So this corresponds to, of course, the first point. The hierarchy is a hierarchy, right? So therefore, you got higher salaries when you climb up the ladder. You rise above your current rank, and then you get more. So that's again another feature. And fifth, the job itself is a career and a sole employment of the civil servant. So you cannot do moonlighting. It's not just disencouraged, but it's actually forbidden for civil servants to have a second job outside the current one. So you can even have a part-time job. So this is another. I mean, it's always interesting whenever I talk this topic. So Max Weber, is a German, right, and then wrote about this topic like a couple hundred years ago. But all these features that he wrote back then seems to be still quite consistent with our current system. So it's kind of interesting the way human civilization that we use this model until today. And anyway, so come back here. So the job, you can only have a career inside the system and not outside the system. And as we're going to make it explain it in more detail, of course, I mean, this is an advantage of bureaucracy because it creates and provides stability for people and the system. But at the same time, it also creates problems because if it's viewed as an independent kingdom, then of course information inside can be pretty exclusive, and sometimes they also have problem understanding things that happened outside the system. But anyway, this is one of the important features of it. And six, the official does not own his or her office. So this is another thing. Everyone, in a sense, rotates, through different institutional channels. So this person could be, this official can assume this position for now, but he or she might be moved to a different position later. So one doesn't have to work for a single ministry forever. So for example, like I think a lot of friends of yours or they might start working at a particular ministry, but they later can actually move on to other different ministry and then take an entirely different role. So the office is there always, but people, they float around, they can move. And then seventh, the official is subject to control and discipline, and especially officials. I mean, they are not elected, but these bureaucrats, of course, they are also delegated, a substantial amount of power, and therefore internally there's also internal mechanism for control and discipline for the behavior of these civil servants. And finally, promotion is based on superiors' judgments. Okay, so that's one thing that I guess sometimes would be a little bit off-putting. It's off-putting for some people. And, aside, for example, a lot of students here, your IR majors, right? And then I'm not sure why you want to join the department, but because you have a dream about becoming a diplomat someday, right? But a lot of my former students, when they had a chance to be interns in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, well, most of the cases they would come back and say, I don't want to be diplomats anymore. So they got totally disillusioned about this career. And I think that's because, first of all, it's a hierarchy. So one thing that I have to say, that is a little bit ironic. I used to tell a friend of mine in MOFA, in Ministry of Foreign Affairs here, and so because she was asking me, of course, how it went with all the students and how they thought about the career of being diplomats in the future, and I said, well, and of course, she also shared with me the problems she was dealing with some new recruits. And I said, well, that's very obvious, right? We're teaching students like international politics, foreign policy making, and but when did you get to make policies? You are now Minister of Foreign Affairs, right? And once you, I don't know, I mean, it's a tough exam, I know, but once you pass the exam, what you're dealing with actually most of the things are pretty trivial. You could be visa officers, right? Somewhere in Africa and then issue visas and interview people when they want to come to Taiwan. And you're doing things like, arranging parties with foreign diplomats. And so, I mean, you're not making foreign policies, for God's sake. So why do you need to know all these theories in IR, right? You have nothing to do with that. So I told her that, well, I mean, so that's why, I mean, people got disappointed totally. Because once they get into the ministry, they have to go through a long process of promotion until they can actually know something about how our government makes foreign policies. And most people don't even get a chance, I have to say. But that's just, that's just a life. So that's why I answered her. Well, I mean, so it's not surprising that you got disappointed new recruits who don't want to be diplomats anymore. It's not surprising. I don't know how she's going to deal with that, but that's just. But the thing is, it reflects, foreign affairs. Ministry of Foreign Affairs itself is also a bureaucracy, and therefore, if you are not patient enough, and if you don't dream big, it's probably hard for you to stay inside the ministry, I guess. Anyway, so the thing is, the promotion is based on superior's judgment. So the problem about this is that sometimes it's subjective, of course, but also you cannot, if you are a super high achiever and you can do a lot of things, that doesn't necessarily reflect in your career advancement. It depends on your superiors. So, okay, but it's a little bit different from private sectors, because in the private sectors, you have less structure, less hierarchy, and therefore sometimes people can get very successful at very young age, right? Make a lot of money, like Mark Zuckerberg, right? He made a fortune in, I think, his early 20s. So that can happen in the private sector, but it's less likely in the bureaucracy. It's very stable, but it's also sometimes not too exciting. But anyway, but as I said, it's surprising that Max Weber gave us all 8 different definitions for a bureaucracy, and all of these features still fit our system today. But the thing is, I'm not sure. Well, of course, I mean, you don't have to memorize all these. I mean, you just have to understand this is how he views bureaucracy, and roughly speaking, this is also the kind of bureaucracy we have for every country. But the thing is, the idea of the bureaucracy actually is not that off-putting in itself. And why? So let me give you some other interesting, maybe more exciting lessons about this. So bureaucracy, even though when everyone studies bureaucracy, it might not be interesting enterprise. But the thing is, for a while, I think bureaucracy or a very independent and professional bureaucracy is viewed as a recipe for success in East Asia. And so let me give you this quickly. So theory of developmental states, we will touch upon this, not now, but in a few weeks. So we mentioned this actually last semester when we had that week on modern states. And developmental states refers to a class of states where governments in these states pursue economic development. So it's not that usual in the sense that, well, if you want to say what's the goal of the modern state, it's hard to specify, right? Because everyone has different objectives. But when this term was coined back to 1980s and 1990s, it was created to describe a couple of states here in East Asia: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And the reason is, well, I mean, if you ever heard about Asian economic miracle, which is a term coined again in early 1990s, it was to basically to describe a very miraculous situation, economic development in these countries, especially after the Second World War, because all these states, they were devastated after the Second World War. But first of all, Japan, it took Japan, less than 20 years to recover from the Second World War and became previously the third largest or second largest economy in the world. And then following Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, Singapore as well, they also became very successful examples of recovery, economic recovery, and prosperity from the Second World War. So previously, there was actually pretty famous book published by the World Bank in 1993. It was a summary basically of what these states have done back then. And of course, the developmental state as a term was coined before that book. But the essential concept is that all these states, the Japanese government, South Korean government, Taiwanese governments, these governments, they have a very central goal in their governance, which is to promote the economic growth in these countries. And that's how this concept came about. And of course, later you have these East Asian tigers, referring to Taiwan, South Korea, I think Hong Kong and Singapore, and not Japan. Japan is not a tiger. Right. But the thing is, why am I mentioning this here? And the reason is, when people study all these countries, they also found there's something in common, and which is the Confucian tradition of bureaucracy and state autonomy. What does that mean? It means that, first of all, what's a Confucian tradition of bureaucracy? So bureaucracy, again, when I started this topic, we used Max Weber, obviously not a Chinese. So, but the thing is, in China, I mean, there is also a long tradition of having like professional scholars to be officials, even though the expertise defined back then obviously was very different from the expertise we have today. But there's a long tradition that in Chinese, even though it was like the dynasties, right? So all these imperial courts, on top of the, except you have, of course, the royal families. So these are the emperors, right? Or empresses. But, except for all these people, the royalties, they actually have a huge system of bureaucracies as well. So these are the important players that help emperors run the country. So there's a long tradition, and especially the Confucian tradition, as it has it, the selection of these bureaucrats are based on exams, right? So these exams, the traditional exams, obviously existed in China a long time ago. And of course, since there's a huge influence from China on Korea and Japan, Taiwan, of course, and therefore all these countries inherited the system and culture of Confucianism and also their views on bureaucracy as a professional scholar. So that's the first feature shared by all these countries, successful East Asian tigers. But at the same time, it's not just about expertise and professionalism in this system, but also another important thing, the state autonomy. So why are we talking about state autonomy here? And what does that mean? Let me give you another term, and the contrast will help you understand the importance of this concept. So, well, we might talk about this later, but in the political economy literature, there's another term called the state capture. What is the state capture? This is related to something we just talked about, rent creation, right? Especially when I talk about the trade policy example. So there are some private sector industries because they cannot compete with foreign goods, and therefore they use lobby or they lobby the government for adopting protective policies for them, so they don't have to face the competition. And as I just explained, of course, this is very bad to the country's economy and also very bad to the consumers. But when that happens, there are political economists. So we create this term, state capture, means that the state is captured by these special interests, because the state is doing something not in the interest of all people, but in the interest of these special industrial groups. That's when state is captured. All right. So this is when the state obviously has no way to plan in a long-term fashion. All right. So if you understand the concept of state capture, which means state is used as a tool or instrument to enforce or to implement the policies in favor of special interests. Okay. And then when it came to these East Asian states, they found these states actually are not captured by the special interests. And the reason is not just because of the professionalism in the bureaucracy, but also because these bureaucracies in these different East Asian states, they're able to make policies independent of the influence of the special interest group. So of course, every country has all kinds of special interest groups, right? All kinds of different companies. I mean, in the case of trade protection, they all want this, so they don't have to work hard. They can just, donate money to the politicians, and they can get, live in a comfortable environment. But the thing is, these, as I said, people found in these East Asian states, their states are pretty autonomous from the influence of the special interests in these countries, and therefore they can not just plan economic proposals for the state independently, but also for the long term. So, for example, even though there are lots of I would say revisionist theories recently about Taiwan's success. For example, I'm not sure if this is still part of your textbook previously. There's 10 big constructions, right? During the Jiang Jingguo era, right? So essentially a lot of people attributed Taiwan's economic success to those 10 big constructions, right? Even though now people are saying these are like white elephants and didn't really work well. But that's, anyway, other people's arguments. But the thing is, I don't want to, of course, focus on specific policies, but at least among all these 4 different states or tigers, their governments can make policies in a long-term fashion, which means, these investments, you have to know, when they were made, it's not like they're going to have returns in a few years, right? It's a long-term investment. So they might not work next year or the year after next year, but they might work in the 3rd or 4th year. But once they work, then they're going to bring the country a lot of benefits. So this is a long-term plan. But if you, for example, are sensitive enough to like what we have been talking about, so in a democracy, most of the governments have to be subject to elections in 3 or 4 years or 5 years. So it's sometimes hard for these governments to plan something longer than 5 years. Because of course, I mean, if you cannot show your voters the beef or this is what I have done, why would voter have to vote for you? So there's a question about in a democracy, politicians have to be or designed to be short-sighted because they have to come up, because elections come up every 4 or 3 years. But in these countries back then, the bureaucracy can actually have a very strong continuity, and because it's because I mean the thing is we're going to talk about bureaucracy in different countries in the next slides, and you probably have of course we won't get the exact numbers, but the sizes of bureaucracy in different countries obviously are very different. In the US, a lot of bureaucrats, they are political appointees. Of course, I mean, we have that kind of entrance exams here in Taiwan or the joint exams for all the bureaucrats here. But that doesn't exist in the United States, right? Individual departments recruit their own people. You don't have that kind of exams. So which means it's here, bureaucracy is viewed as very dependent. It's a system, right, as we described. And people, when they join the bureaucracy, they also create certain kind of identity. Maybe they are proud of the identity, maybe. But the thing is, it's independent kingdom, almost like. And therefore, you have a very strong continuity inside the system, and therefore that create the conditions for this kind of long-term planning. Even though I would say, it's not without question whether Taiwan today is still a developmental state. This is a question. But there's no denying, at least going back to 1980s and 1990s, indeed, Taiwanese bureaucrats, they had the power and ability to create long-term projects. And all these long-term projects, sometimes you can only see the benefits, 4 or 5 years later. And there are lots of other examples like, the science park in Hsinchu, right? So these are when they were created, not necessarily everyone knew this is going to be, hit a jackpot. TSMC, for example, no one knows. I mean, no one knew this back, like 20 or 30 years ago. So, okay, so let's conclude this part. So basically, first of all, developmental state used to be a label for all these East Asian tigers. And of course, the theory was created because all these people saw the success in these models. And when they actually studied this model, they found that there are two important features. One is the kind of long-held Confucian tradition of bureaucracy, and basically people have to have certain expertise to become the bureaucrats, and the tradition is has existed in this region for quite a while. And second, with all these very professional and bureaucrats, they can also make long-term policies independent of the influence of private interests. And that's why these states can be so successful. Okay, so that's the reason sometimes bureaucracies, well, I mean, bureaucrats or bureaucracy is not a good term, right? When you say someone is very bureaucratic, it's sometimes a very negative term to call someone, right? But the thing is, for some reason, well, not for some reason, so for this reason, bureaucracy actually is connected to the successful story of Taiwan and other East Asian tigers back then. So, questions?
I think those 4 countries back then were supposed to be called as dragons.
Well, they're dragons. Sometimes they call dragons or tigers, but small dragons, right?
But like tigers are supposed to be like those 4 countries in Southeast Asia.
Which 4?
Let me check it later. But I think there's difference between dragons and tigers.
No, these are just, I think, of course you can call them dragons or tigers. It doesn't matter, right?
But it's like technical term.
It's not. Why is that technical?
Because it just refers to those countries, and then later on, others.
Right. So that's for now. But previously, I think tigers and dragons, people used them interchangeably. But it doesn't matter. I mean,
Because in
it's not a technical term.
Tigers, they refer to different countries, different sets of countries.
No, but what I'm saying is, whether you call them tigers or dragons, what does that imply? Right? It's just for fun. So, but anyways, but the key thing is you have all these countries that are viewed as successful developmental states. Well, I guess what you should take away is the developmental state. This is the professional term, not tigers or dragons. You can call it elephants too, I suppose. The point is they are developmental states as opposed to other type of states, because I mean, we do have other types of states, a laissez-faire or failed states. There are all kinds of different labels for them, but it's not about the animals. Okay, so next. Okay, and then so as I said, I mean, there are all kinds of different models of bureaucracies in the world, across the world. And then in US, as I said, most of the people, I mean, they are political appointees. They are officials, sometimes not through exams, but just, selections from the superiors. But in either Europe or Asia, sometimes you have this kind of grade schools tradition in bureaucracies. I believe in France, in Japan. Well, the thing is, in Japan, previously, lots of bureaucrats were from University of Tokyo. I think it's no longer the case. I saw the statistics a while ago. I mean, nowadays the graduates from Todai or University of Tokyo might not view bureaucracy as the best destination for their career. And in French case too, I think this is just what people like to talk about. The schools, there are these two schools, Polytechnic. These are two important schools for training the bureaucrats. And here in Taiwan too, as I said, I mean, NTU, of course, used to be also, I guess, a bastion. Most of the ministers now, most of them are from NTU, but maybe that's not as many as Japan previously. So bureaucracy also, another important feature is that it's supposed to be merit-based and apolitical. So, but this feature also is shared by a lot of different countries. For example, in Great Britain, the bureaucrats eventually can become permanent secretary as opposed to the ministers appointed by the ministries. And of course, as we have said it quite a few times, the ministers, of course, they are politicians. They are individual MPs, and bureaucrats are not. In Japan, in Taiwan too, actually. So most of the bureaucrats, I guess the highest position they can hold will be vice minister. But in Taiwan, of course, sometimes some bureaucrats, if they have connections with parties, and they might be appointed as the minister sometimes, but it's not very usual. But if you continue, have served in the bureaucracy for a long time, it's you can rise up to vice minister in the end before you retire. Also, the long-term planning thing I just mentioned, it's a feature also among several countries. Japan used to be, I mean, there's a famous book actually published in 1983 called MITI. It's actually the shorthand for Ministry of International Trade and Industry. And this is the ministry or organization that created lots of very good economic policies for Japan. And that's why people study MITI. And now it's been changed to METI, so the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, to 2001. But again, in China, of course, it's not a democracy, but actually, it's also famous for making long-term plans. So every 5 years, they will publish these 5-year plans to lay out their industrial targets and economic development trajectories in the next 5 years. It seems that it's about time it's 12:10 already. So we'll stop here and continue to talk about this topic next week. So I'll see you next week.
Excuse me.